light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. Today I just wanted to offer a few thoughts on relating to extraterrestrial life. I hear various friends from time to time talk about being able to communicate with ETs telepathically, or various people have reported in various places of actually having extraterrestrial contact and speaking with people from other worlds and so forth, and oh yeah, they come visit me all the time. I don't know if they do or not, and I'm not here to answer what did or did not happen at Roswell in New Mexico, as whether there was a military cover-up or whatever. This conversation is more about saying, okay, statistically it's improbable that there isn't life on other planets. Given the distances between planets, it's difficult to say whether we'll ever interact with them, but there seem to be more and more people who are leaning in that direction belief-wise. And if we do, I guess one of my first questions is, will humanity have grown up enough by that point that we can finally leave bigotry and prejudice behind? Or will you at some point begin to see signs that say, no ETs served here, or something of that effect? I was part of a weekend conference kind of thing a number of years ago that was focusing on extraterrestrial contact and kind of putting all the different things that have been said all on the table for discussion. And I suggested, as my contribution to the event, what about basic communication? You know, that once we finally get to meet someone from another world, how do we even say hello? And it occurred to me that we can't even can't legitimately presume that they're going to have the same polarities and definitions of life that we do. We can't assume that there will be male and female, or that they will regard age or language or civilization or government or economics the same way that we do. We really can't presume anything. So if you meet an ET, an extraterrestrial, to begin by thinking, is this extraterrestrial male or female, is really quite an absurd and presumptuous question, because the terms may not apply at all. My contribution to all of that was basically to create this, what I called a cross-cultural communication game. Essentially, I came up with a set of cards upon which I had written various qualities that were not defined by age or gender or any of the usual dimensions of personhood. They were words that could be subjectively interpreted. And the basic challenge for each round of the game was that somebody would draw a card and see what's on it and put the card back in the deck, so they were the only one who knew. And then everyone else would get to ask them yes or no questions, trying to guess who or what they were. Not assuming that they were an ET, but in a way similar to communication with ETs, to ask the sorts of questions of, how do you define personhood? The basic point of the whole game, though, was this main consideration or opinion, I guess, that when you meet an extraterrestrial, you can't assume any of the same frame of reference. I mean, every language, every relationship has certain assumptions behind it. What actions are considered friendly? What actions are considered adversarial? What events would be causes for major concern, and what would be causes for no significant concern? And even that varies somewhat according to personality. There are some people who are very detached, or detached isn't really the right word. They're very adaptable to circumstances, so that if this doesn't happen, they're like, well, we'll do something else. And there are other people who are so invested in following the plan and in having things go according to plan that when somebody gets there 5 minutes late, or the flowers arrive and they're chrysanthemums instead of tulips. That suddenly it becomes a major crisis because everything about their expectation and their plan and what they assumed would happen was based on an outcome that didn't happen, that was denied them, that was taken away. In a similar sort of way, I'm reminded of one of the old science fiction movies in which a spaceship arrives, and the first assumption that humanity makes is that they have to be defensive and that this is adversarial and so forth. So an alien person steps out of the spaceship and is shot. And when the alien thereby recognizes the potential for violence, he goes back in the ship, and what comes out is a robot that will respond to the violence in kind, and becomes the destroyer and the adversary they expected at first. The basic point being, in terms of relationships with extraterrestrials, is trying to jump beyond oneself intellectually and accept that they may have hostile intentions, they may have benevolent intentions, they may have intentions where they regard humanity as nothing more than a planet full of laboratory rats to be experimented on and utilized for whatever can be learned from them, but having no specific value in and of themselves. I would say that would be a very ignorant perspective, but it may be an initial perspective, that for some extraterrestrials, humanity is nothing more than insects or laboratory rats. For those who have discovered the capacities of the human spirit, humanity may be the most amazing species they've ever encountered. I'm reminded of the movie Starman, made back in the early 1980s, I believe it was, when he asked the woman, "Do you know what it is about you that so fascinates us? What it is about the human race that is so fascinating that we would risk all of this to be here?" And of course she shakes her head, and he looks at her and he says, "It is that you are at your best when things are at their worst. That when things are at their worst, the very best ingenuity and adaptability and creativity of humanity comes out. The very best compassion comes out after the worst disasters. We're not as nice to each other when everything is going fine. But when there's some external disaster or common enemy, suddenly the creative and collaborative capacity is totally breathtaking." A newer science fiction movie, when Contact, written by Carl Sagan and starring Jodie Foster, she finally gets to ask the ET for the ET's perspective on humanity. And he comments that you're capable of such magnificent dreams and such horrible nightmares, and you think you're so alone, and you're not. There's so much about the way our ideas shape our perception that could be empowering to interaction with extraterrestrials, but could equally be very problematic if we are expecting them to be like us. And in that sense, we can practice on each other in the meantime. If we can get beyond expecting each other to be like us, if we can treat every person we meet as someone who may or may not have all sorts of commonalities with us. We may meet someone who, if we want to go to the area of orientation, a man meets another man and suddenly finds out that he's not another heterosexual man, he's a gay man. Well, suddenly that changes the dynamics enormously. I didn't get to see it, but I heard of a comedy sketch created by Carol Burnett around this issue, where it was two research scientists assigned to the South Pole. And so there's nobody else, they're stuck there together for 6 months. The one guy finds out the other is gay, and is like, oh no, now he's going to be hitting on me, he's going to be making all sorts of inappropriate comments and gestures and all sorts of things, to which the gay character responds, well, I'm really not interested in you. And then the conversation suddenly does this amusing flip to, why? Am I not attractive? What do you mean? Is something wrong with me? And suddenly he's all defensive, because on one moment he wanted the gay man not to be attractive. The next man he's like, well, am I unattractive? And it was this fascinating dialogue of going back and forth where each of them had to figure out, so where do we stand in the presence of such diversity? You know, if we meet an extraterrestrial and they like eating something that we didn't realize was food, maybe they're a crystalline life form that happens to really, really love eating concrete. How would I know what they like to eat? You know, that's obviously something I couldn't eat, but that means that if they were to invite me to dinner and they're serving concrete, obviously I'd have to bring my own dish. Those are absurd and comedic differences, you know, exaggerations for extreme. But there's a sense in which all of that is simply an exaggeration of the relationships we have with each other. There's a sense in which the relationships that we may have with extraterrestrials, or that we have with the extraterrestrials that we've imagined in our minds. I mean, in a sense, our imaginations have already jumped ahead to where we have imagined interactions with extraterrestrials. We've imagined looking at each other, communicating by music, communicating by mathematical principles of prime numbers, all sorts of different things. Those imaginations and projections may be helpful as long as we look at them as possibilities and as alternative ways of making a connection of comprehension, of understanding, a way of thinking something, conveying something, and remarkably being understood to at least a minimal degree. That's going on already right here on Earth between all the different races and peoples. You know, then we meet somebody of a different religion and suddenly they don't want to eat meat on Fridays, or any number of different things that their practices and sensitivities and considerations don't need to be necessarily causes for alarm. Where in some cases it can be a little more touchy is if there are cultural standards, things related to the treatment of women, for example. I mean, we have to concede that for a large part of human history, women were considered property. In many places, hopefully most places within the current age, that's no longer the case. Obviously, even as I say that, I have a certain bias. People who lived in those times when women were property, even the women within those times, would find my comment very strange, because they had an understanding of the world that assumed a certain kind of relationship and a certain kind of give and take, a certain kind of responsibility that, you know, in many places women were not expected to protect themselves. They legitimately expected to be protected. In a similar sort of way, if you were to meet an extraterrestrial or a person from another country, there would be assumptions about the dynamics, about the roles that people would play. The other thing that we haven't really got into at all yet when it comes to dealing with extraterrestrials is, you know, how do we conceive of language? Numerous science fiction movies and television shows have suggested the possibility of telepathic language. That would mean that there is some kind of invisible thought wave or something that travels from one entity to another in order to communicate. Just because we don't have a way of measuring it at the present time, we can't say it's not there, but we may be getting ahead of ourselves to presume that it is there. There may be, for example, a million very, very subtle nuances, juxtapositions, costumes, gestures, how close you stand to another person, all sorts of things that would convey understanding within an extraterrestrial species that may be meaningless to us. Does it mean anything if I step out my front door and look to each of the 4 directions and then go back into my house? Somebody might interpret that means I was looking for something, but they didn't know what. Someone else of a particular spiritual belief system, depending on the facial expression or if I nodded my head or what, may have interpreted that I was doing some kind of ritual of honoring the 4 directions. That's something, a belief that would resonate at least somewhat within many tribal societies. The difficulty, the supreme challenge, I guess, of the human race interacting with an extraterrestrial species is the challenge of suspending judgment and withholding expectations. 2 things that we use to abuse and bombard and assault each other quite frequently throughout human history. It is a worthy discussion that could go on for a very long time, though, to say what the distinction between judgment and discernment is. Judgment, it would seem, wants to render a final verdict, so to speak, wants to categorize things, wants there to be finality. Discernment is on the opposite end of the relationship, of the action, saying, where should this go next? Judgment says this is where it stops. Discernment says, where should it go? That may be the most telling difference between the two. But when we look at each other with judgment, we're creating restrictions that don't allow undiscovered potential to ever be expressed. When we look at each other with discernment, we're looking for ways to empower the other person and to empower ourselves. That same sort of dynamic needs to be applied if or when we ever get to interact with extraterrestrials. That we use discernment to empower the relationship rather than judgment to require something or to demand something or to restrict something. That while one is contracting, the other is expanding. And the more it expands, the more room we have to develop the relationship in whatever way we choose, or in whatever multiple ways we choose. Somewhere in amongst all of that are the various conspiracy theories of people who have told me about the ETs who are out to get us, and those are the good ETs and those are the bad ones. And I'm not sure how they would know that so definitively. It would seem that such judgments, not discernments, must be based upon very limited knowledge and a very limited range of experiences. If I were an ET and I came to Earth and I wanted to understand humanity, I don't know if I would live long enough to ever get to that point, because I could spend hundreds of years going around the world experiencing all of the different cultures, all of the different customs, and having to integrate that in the United States you wear black to a funeral and white to a wedding, and in Japan you wear black to a wedding and white to a funeral. Is somebody confused, or how can there be such completely opposite differences? There is so much diversity within humanity that to then take a step and say extraterrestrial life, that, it seems to me, would necessitate that we expand our current range of diversity by a factor of 10 to 100, or infinite, or to infinity even. As many differences as there can be among us, there's far more differences that there could be between us and people on other planets. That being the case, if you're really, really interested in interaction with extraterrestrials, and if that actually becomes something relatively common within our lifetimes, dealing with humanity now is your chance to practice on integrating diversity, on being honest and fair, and having mutual respect between yourself and someone who's completely different, someone who speaks a different language. Maybe putting 2 people who don't speak each other's language at all into a room for 8 hours and see what sort of understandings they're able to create after 8 hours, just because they're not allowed to leave the room and all they have to interact with is each other. That they can sit there staring at each other in silence for 8 hours, or they can begin to interact and see if how, or rather see how, with nothing more than gestures, nothing more than eye contact, nothing more than body posture or motions, how much understanding can they accurately pass from one person to another. It kind of reminds me of a game of telephone, I think it's called, which kind of relates back to the early days of the telephone lines and such. The idea being that people would win this game. People would form a line. Person on one end of the line would whisper something into the ear of the person next to him, who would whisper it into the ear of the person next to them, and so on down the line. And then they would compare what the person at the beginning said and what the person on the end heard. And it was usually quite funny how much it changed from one end to the other. Well, to take that one step further, when I was in college, there were a bunch of us who spoke various foreign languages sitting at a table in the cafeteria, and we decided to try an international version. So we passed a phrase from English to German to English to Spanish to English to French to English, and there was no relationship whatsoever going in and out of that many shifts, and that was just 3 human languages. We have, 200 to 300 different human languages on this planet. And there are many more languages that have died out and that are no longer in use. With that much linguistic flexibility and diversity, it seems to me that really one of the basic assumptions we have to begin with for extraterrestrials and for each other is to assume from the start that you don't understand correctly, and to ask enough questions to move toward understanding, and to move toward as complete an understanding as you can, but to never assume that you fully understand anything. If we began with that kind of humility toward each other, instead of the dictatorial arrogance that says, this is the answer, this is the way it should be, this is the only correct answer. Dogmatism is a problem, whether it occurs in language or in a church or in any theology. To say that there is only one right answer, and it's the one I'm about to tell you, devalues and shoves aside everybody else who has a different answer. We could just be in one of those international or multilinguistic games of telephone, of hearing something and repeating it, trusting the source, and yet not always taking into account how many previous sources there were. That the person at the end of that line of multilingual telephone in the cafeteria game that I played, that person doesn't know, except in that situation, of course, they would know, but if they had met on the street somewhere and a person passed along a piece of information, they have no idea how many other people came in line before them, how many different places that information has been before it got to them, how many different times the manuscript of whatever book was transcribed, through how many different languages to get to the present form and place. And of course, the more times of transference, the more likely it is that anything could have gone wrong. Not because anyone intended it to, not because anyone was being sloppy, but simply by the very nature of language and linguistics and grammar and vocabulary itself. The interesting thing there would also be to consider the life experience of the translator. That on a day when a particular translator had, been cut off in traffic or something and arrived to work to do the translation, having experienced being put upon and devalued and marginalized, and somebody was nasty to me, and so they approached translation with a negative attitude, not because they mean to, it's all subconscious, but approaching with a negative attitude because of what they've experienced and where they have been emotionally and psychologically placed by their experiences before embarking on translation. And suddenly, for the first half hour, all their translations are coming out very cynical. And they may not even realize it because they're looking from the inside out and don't realize how they're being. All of these things, though, all these variables, all these slight shifts, are, of course, equally as possible for the ETs. That the extraterrestrial race may intend to send a well-schooled ambassador to make the first contact with the human race, and that particular ambassador may have one very hellish, difficult adversarial experience trying to land the ship, and everything's frustrating, and just at the moment that they are finally down and just frustrated as all can be, suddenly they make their first contact, and the words come flying out with a little bit more intensity than they intended. The basic point being that it is not just giving each other the freedom to be human, but it is also giving the ETs the freedom to be an ET, recognizing that they may or may not have emotions also. They may or may not have good days and bad days, and days when things work and days when they don't. And somehow, I guess the miracle of life is the hope that even with all these variables of how are you feeling, what are you thinking, did you just come from a bad experience, or how can we make this a positive one if you're already starting in a place where it's difficult? Allowing all of that and approaching any contact with humility, with love, with sensitivity, with the assumption that more often than not, we don't understand. But we can talk about it. Thank you very much for watching.